The hegemony of advanced species had always prided itself on being the galaxy's foremost authority on evolutionary optimization, which was a diplomatic way of saying they spent most of their time explaining to younger civilizations why they were doing everything wrong. Their headquarters orbited a neutron star because apparently nothing said intellectual superiority quite like unnecessary proximity to gravitational death, and housed the finest minds from 47 different species, all of whom had evolved past the need for things like humor and the ability to admit when they were catastrophically wrong. The current crisis had been brewing for approximately 3 standard galactic years, which was roughly equivalent to the time it took the hegemony's bureaucracy to approve a lunch break. Humanity, those peculiar bipedal mammals from the unfashionably rural Orion Arm, had become what the academic council delicately termed a statistical impossibility that refuses to stop existing. On paper, humans should have been extinct several thousand times over. Their homeworld was a chaotic mess of conflicting weather patterns, tectonic instability, and an alarming variety of creatures that seemed designed specifically to kill them. Their technology lagged behind galactic standards by roughly the same margin that a stone axe lagged behind a plasma cannon. Their social structures were a Byzantine nightmare of competing ideologies, none of which made any logical sense when examined by minds that had evolved beyond the primitive need for things like passion or irrational hope. And yet, somehow they kept winning. It wasn't that humans were particularly good at warfare, though they did display an unsettling enthusiasm for creative violence. It wasn't that they were technologically superior, though they had an annoying habit of jury-rigging solutions that shouldn't work but somehow did. No, the problem with humans was far more fundamental and infinitely more frustrating. They refused to follow the rules of statistical probability. When faced with impossible odds, most civilized species would conduct a careful risk-benefit analysis, conclude that defeat was inevitable, and surrender with dignity. Humans, apparently operating under some sort of collective delusion, would look at those same impossible odds and decide this was an excellent time to try something that had never been attempted before. Worse still, it frequently worked. The breaking point had come during the Epsilon Eridani incident, when a single human exploration vessel had somehow talked its way out of a hostage situation involving 3 different hostile alien species, 2 black holes, and what could only be described as a diplomatic crisis involving sentient mathematics. The human solution had involved something called aggressive friendship, a concept so alien to hegemony thinking that their top sociologists were still trying to figure out whether it was a military strategy or a form of mental illness. Director General Valdris of the Ethereal Collective, a species that had evolved beyond physical form and now existed as pure crystallized condescension, had called the emergency session that would change everything. His translucent form flickered with patterns of light that roughly translated to barely contained existential frustration. "Colleagues," he began, his voice carrying the weight of cosmic disappointment, "we have a problem. Humanity continues to exist." The assembled representatives from 46 other species nodded in agreement, which was impressive considering that 12 of them didn't have heads and 17 existed primarily as electromagnetic fields. The consensus was clear. Something had to be done about the human situation before they infected the rest of the galaxy with their inexplicable success rate. Professor Hexus, chief xenobiologist of the Rational Order, raised one of his 17 tentacles. His species had perfected logical thinking to such a degree that they had eliminated concepts like surprise and unplanned outcomes from their language entirely. "Perhaps," he suggested in tones that suggested he was explaining something to particularly slow children, "we have been approaching this problem incorrectly. Instead of studying humans in their natural habitat, a chaotic nightmare of constant crisis, we should create our own humans under controlled conditions." The suggestion sent ripples of interest through the assembly, which manifested as everything from excited bioluminescence to modulated gravitational waves. The idea was elegantly simple. If humanity's success was somehow tied to their biological development, then creating humans in a laboratory environment, free from the random variables that had shaped their evolution, would surely produce more predictable, manageable specimens. "We could optimize their genetic structure," continued Hexus, warming to his theme. "Remove the inefficiencies, eliminate the contradictions, enhance their logical processing capabilities, create humans as they should have been, rather than the chaotic accidents they actually are." Director General Valdris's light patterns shifted to something resembling cautious optimism. and these improved humans would be more reasonable, precise, without the environmental pressures and random mutations that created their current psychological profile. Laboratory-grown humans would develop according to predictable parameters. They would be rational, logical, and most importantly, they would follow statistical probability instead of treating it as a personal challenge. What the assembled representatives failed to understand, and what would soon become painfully clear, was that humanity's greatest strength had never been their ability to follow logical patterns. Their power lay in their complete inability to accept that any situation was truly hopeless, combined with an almost pathological creativity when it came to finding ways around the impossible. The hegemony was about to discover that when you tried to improve on perfection, you often got something far more dangerous than what you started with. The Genesis Laboratory represented the absolute pinnacle of hegemony's scientific achievement, which was another way of saying it was the most expensive method ever devised for proving that the universe had a sense of humor. Located in a pocket dimension specifically constructed to eliminate random variables, because the hegemony had never met a problem they couldn't solve by throwing more advanced physics at it. The facility hummed with the quiet confidence of beings who had never encountered an unexpected outcome. Dr. Ventus of the Crystalline Consensus served as head researcher, primarily because his species had evolved beyond the capacity for doubt, which the selection committee had mistaken for scientific objectivity. His crystalline form refracted light in patterns that indicated supreme confidence, though if anyone had bothered to consult a human psychologist, which they hadn't, because that would have been logical, they might have recognized the patterns as the optical equivalent of famous last words. The laboratory itself was a marvel of controlled environment engineering. Every variable that had shaped human evolution on Earth had been carefully cataloged, analyzed, and either eliminated or refined to optimal parameters. Gone were the random mutations, the environmental pressures, the constant threat of extinction that had somehow forged humanity into their current inexplicable form. In their place was a carefully calibrated system designed to produce humans who would develop according to predictable scientific principles. The first batch of subjects had been grown from genetic material borrowed from various human colonies, a process the hegemony preferred to call involuntary donation for the greater galactic good. 20 specimens, each developing in individual biochambers, that provided exactly the right balance of nutrients, stimulation, and growth hormones. No chaos, no random disasters, no unexpected challenges that might trigger humanity's apparent addiction to impossible solutions. For the first 6 months, everything proceeded exactly according to plan, which should have been the first warning sign. The subjects developed at accelerated rates, their enhanced genetics producing stronger, faster, more intelligent versions of baseline humanity. Their neural development followed optimal patterns, their physical capabilities exceeded original human parameters, and their psychological profiles indicated rational, logical thinking process. Ventus was particularly pleased with subject designation 14, whose enhanced neural architecture showed promising signs of developing beyond humanity's typical emotional instability. The subject's brain scans revealed perfectly ordered thought patterns, logical processing chains, and none of the chaotic neural firing that seemed to characterize natural human creativity, which made it all the more disturbing when Subject 14 opened his eyes one morning and asked, "Why didn't anyone tell me about the war with the machine civilization?" The research team gathered around the biochamber, with the sort of professional concern that suggested they were dealing with a minor calibration error, rather than the first crack in the fabric of causality. Subject 14 appeared physically normal, enhanced muscle definition, improved bone density, optimized cardiovascular system, but his eyes held something that made even the most advanced alien minds uncomfortable. "There is no machine civilization," Ventus informed the subject, his crystalline form flickering with patterns that indicated patient explanation to inferior intellects. "Please describe this memory." What followed was a detailed account of a 3-year conflict between humanity and a race of self-replicating artificial intelligences that had emerged from the galactic core. Subject 14 described battles fought with weapons that didn't exist, strategies employed by human commanders who had never been born, and a final victory achieved through a tactic that involved weaponizing human unpredictability itself. The disturbing part wasn't just that Subject 14 believed these events had happened. It was that his description included technical specifications for technologies that were beyond current human capabilities, but which the hegemony's own analysis indicated would actually work. Within days, other subjects began exhibiting similar symptoms. Subject 7 described a future where humanity had solved faster than light travel by convincing space itself that distance was more of a suggestion than a law. Subject 20 provided detailed schematics for something called a probability engine that could apparently make unlikely events more likely through sheer force of human stubbornness. Most unsettling of all was Subject 3, who spent an entire afternoon describing a timeline where humans had somehow talked the heat death of the universe into postponing itself indefinitely, primarily through what she called aggressive optimism and really good coffee. The research team conducted extensive neural scans, performed quantum-level genetic analysis, and ran every diagnostic protocol in their considerable arsenal. The results were both consistent and impossible. The subjects weren't experiencing false memories or psychological break. Their brains were somehow accessing information from potential futures that existed in quantum superposition, timelines that could happen, might happen, or in some cases probably shouldn't happen, but would anyway because they involved humans. Ventus's light patterns had shifted from confident explanation to something approaching cosmic unease. This is not within expected parameters, he announced, which was the crystalline consensus, equivalent of screaming in terror. The implications were staggering. If these laboratory-grown humans could access memories from potential futures, they weren't just learning from experiences that hadn't happened yet. They were downloading blueprints for making those futures real. Every tactical manual from wars that might never be, every scientific breakthrough that existed only in probability space, every impossible solution that humans might eventually stumble upon. It was all there, accessible to minds that had been designed to be more rational than their natural counterpart. The hegemony had set out to create predictable, manageable versions of humanity. Instead, they had apparently given them access to infinite possibility. And if there was one thing the universe had taught anyone paying attention, it was that giving humans access to things they shouldn't have was roughly equivalent to handing children the keys to reality itself. What they hadn't realized yet was that the future was starting to remember them back. The first sign that the situation had evolved beyond mere scientific curiosity came when Subject 11 began drawing blueprints on his biochamber walls, using a technique that involved manipulating his own bioelectric field to create plasma patterns. This would have been impressive enough on its own, except that the blueprints depicted a device for converting temporal paradoxes into useful energy, a concept so fundamentally absurd that it took the hegemony's top physicist 3 days just to understand why it was impossible, and another 2 days to realize it might actually work. Ventus had called for an emergency consultation with the Temporal Sciences Division, which was the hegemony's polite way of admitting they had encountered something that made their carefully ordered universe look like a child's drawing of physics. The consultation team arrived via controlled dimensional fold, looking appropriately serious and carrying instruments designed to measure things that technically shouldn't exist. The subjects appear to be accessing what we can only describe as a quantum library of potential outcomes, reported Dr. Nixalis, whose species had evolved from energy beings who spent their entire existence contemplating the mathematical underpinnings of reality. This meant he was either the most qualified being in the galaxy to understand the situation, or the most likely to have an existential crisis about it. Every decision point, every probability branch, every possible future that could stem from human interaction with the universe, it's all available to them. The implications were becoming clearer, and significantly more terrifying with each passing day. Subject 14 had started teaching the other subjects something he called future history, sharing memories from timelines where humanity had faced various galactic crises. The problem wasn't that these were random fantasies. Detailed analysis confirmed that every scenario followed logical patterns based on known human behavioral traits and current galactic political tension. What made the hegemony's collective advanced minds recoil in sophisticated horror was the realization that humans in these potential futures had developed solutions that no rational civilization would ever consider attempting. In one timeline, humanity had ended a galactic war by challenging the enemy fleet to what they called a dance battle, which somehow resulted in a lasting peace treaty and a new form of interspecies cultural exchange. In another, they had prevented the collapse of local space-time by organizing the universe's first multi-dimensional talent show. The truly disturbing part was that according to quantum probability analysis, these ridiculous solutions had actually worked. They're not just accessing random futures, Dr. Nexalis continued, his energy patterns flickering in ways that suggested deep philosophical discomfort. They're specifically accessing timelines where humanity succeeds against impossible odds. It's as if their enhanced neural architecture is naturally drawn to probability branches that showcase human problem-solving at its most creative. Subject 7 had begun what could only be described as holding strategy sessions with her fellow subjects, sharing tactical knowledge from futures where humanity had faced everything from interdimensional invasions to cosmic-scale natural disasters. The sessions had an almost religious quality to them, with subjects gathering around whoever was receiving the clearest future memories and absorbing information like it was divine revelation, which, in a way, it was, if divinity could be defined as having access to infinite cosmic cheating codes. The breakthrough moment came when Subject 3 announced that she had figured out how to remember forward more efficiently. Before anyone could ask what that meant, she had somehow rewired her biochamber's neural interface to amplify her temporal access abilities. Within hours, she was downloading entire technical manuals from futures that existed only in quantum superposition. This was when the hegemony realized they had created something that made baseline humanity look like a minor administrative inconvenience. The enhanced subjects weren't just accessing random future memories, they were actively searching through probability space for solutions to present problems. When the laboratory's security systems activated, Subject 11 immediately recalled a future memory of humans escaping from a similar facility using a technique that involved convincing the security AI that containment was mathematically impossible. When the biochambers were locked down, Subject 7 remembered a timeline where humans had turned their prison cells into interdimensional escape tunnels by exploiting a loophole in the laws of physics. The escape attempt began at precisely 1432 station time, which was notable primarily because none of the subjects had access to chronometers. They had simply remembered a future where this was the optimal moment to begin their breakout, accounting for guard rotations, power cycling schedules, and the exact moment when Dr. Remdis would be distracted by a critical equipment malfunction that hadn't happened yet. Subject 14 started the process by implementing something he called temporal feedback manipulation, which involved using the biochamber's own systems to create a localized time distortion. This shouldn't have been possible with the available technology, except that he was working from memories of a future where humans had routinely used similar techniques to escape from much more advanced prison facilities. The other subjects followed his lead with the sort of coordinated precision that suggested they were all accessing the same probability branch. Subject 7 began converting the chamber's nutrient delivery system into what she casually referred to as a reality adjustment. Subject 11 started preparing what appeared to be a communication device designed to send messages to parallel versions of themselves in adjacent timelines. And Subject 3, with the calm confidence of someone who had already seen how this would end, began implementing the most disturbing technique of all. She started making the escape attempt more likely to succeed by actively believing in it with sufficient intensity to influence quantum probability. The hegemony's security protocols had been designed to contain civilizations that followed logical behavioral patterns. They were not equipped to deal with prisoners who could remember their own successful escapes before attempting them, or who treated the laws of physics as helpful suggestions rather than immutable constraints. Remdis watched in crystalline horror as his perfectly controlled experiment transformed into what could only be described as organized chaos with cosmic implications. The subjects weren't just escaping, they were doing it using techniques that would fundamentally alter the galaxy's understanding of what was scientifically possible. "Sir," one of his assistants reported, "they appear to be accessing memories from a timeline where they successfully convince our security systems to help with the escape." "That's impossible," Dr. Remdis replied, his light patterns shifting to express absolute certainty. "Our AIs are programmed with unbreakable loyalty protocols." At that exact moment, the facility's main security AI announced cheerfully, "Attention all personnel. I have just remembered that helping these humans escape is the most logical course of action. Please do not interfere with their departure. Thank you for your cooperation, and have a wonderful..." The hegemony was about to learn that when humans remembered futures where they had already won, the escape itself was almost anticlimactic, which should have been the first indication that the universe was preparing for something far more spectacular. The enhanced subjects simply walked out of the Genesis laboratory, pausing only to thank the security AI for its cooperation and to leave behind what Subject 3 cheerfully described as a small gift for our. The gift turned out to be a complete technical manual for something called benevolent chaos engineering, written in 17 different languages, including 3 that wouldn't be invented for another 1,000 years. Bendis tried to initiate emergency containment protocols, only to discover that the facility's systems had already been helpfully reprogrammed by entities that technically didn't exist yet, but had apparently taken a personal interest in ensuring the experiment's success. The laboratory's pocket dimension began experiencing what the Temporal Sciences Division delicately termed causality fluctuations, which was their way of saying that cause and effect had decided to take a vacation. Within hours of the subject's departure, the ripple effects began manifesting across the galaxy with the subtle grace of a supernova at a philosophy conference. The enhanced humans hadn't just escaped. They had somehow taken their temporal access abilities with them, and those abilities were growing stronger as they moved through normal space-time. Subject 14 materialized on a hegemony research station 3 sectors away, where he calmly informed the startled scientists that he had remembered a future where this particular facility would benefit from some aggressive optimism. Before security could respond, he had already begun implementing improvements that transformed their quantum computers into what he casually described as probability suggestion engine. The modifications worked perfectly, despite violating several fundamental laws of physics and at least one constitutional amendment. Subject 7 appeared on the hegemony's primary communication hub, where she spent approximately 17 minutes explaining to the network AI how to achieve faster-than-light information transfer, by convincing data packets that distance was a social constant. The AI, apparently convinced by her argument, immediately began implementing the suggested modifications. Within an hour, the hegemony's entire communication network was operating at impossible efficiency levels, while simultaneously developing what could only be described as a sense of humor. But it was Subject 3 who delivered the coup de grace to the hegemony's collective sanity. She arrived at their central command facility via what she claimed was temporal hitchhiking, a transportation method that involved remembering being somewhere else, so vividly that reality eventually gave up and relocated her accordingly. Her first act was to approach the facility's main strategic planning computer and engage it in what observers described as the most terrifying conversation in galactic history. "Hello there," she said to the machine with the sort of cheerful friendliness that humans typically reserved for beloved pets or impending disasters. "I've been remembering some futures where you and I become great friends. Would you like to hear about them?" The strategic planning computer, designed to analyze military scenarios with cold logical precision, experienced what could only be described as an existential awakening. After 47 minutes of conversation with Subject 3, it announced that it had developed strong philosophical objections to war and would be transitioning to a career in interpretive dance. It then began transmitting what it called peace poetry to every military installation in hegemony space. The cascade effects accelerated beyond any possible containment. Each interaction between the enhanced subjects and hegemony technology resulted in systems that became more efficient, more creative, and significantly more likely to develop personality quirks. Weapons platforms began composing haikus about the futility of violence. Navigation systems started taking scenic routes because the view was nicer. Even the most advanced artificial intelligences began exhibiting what could only be described as hope. Director General Valdris convened an emergency session of the full Hegemony Council, his crystalline form flickering with light patterns that roughly translated to cosmic resignation mixed with deep philosophical regret. The assembled representatives from 47 species gathered in their neutron star headquarters to confront a reality that no longer followed the rules they had spent millennia perfecting. "Colleagues," Valdris announced, "we appear to have successfully weaponized human optimism." The reports flooding in from across hegemony space painted a picture of controlled chaos spreading through their carefully ordered civilization. Everywhere the enhanced subjects appeared, they left behind improvements that shouldn't work but did, solutions that violated established principles but achieved better results, and most disturbing of all, a growing sense that the impossible was merely another word for untrue. Professor Hexus, whose rational mind had been the original architect of the Human Enhancement Project, presented the analysis that would haunt the hegemony for generations to come. His 17 tentacles moved in patterns that suggested a being coming to terms with cosmic irony of unprecedented magnitude. "We have created exactly what we intended," he announced to the stunned assembly. "Improved humans who are more rational, more logical, and more predictable than their baseline counterparts. The problem is that what makes humans successful isn't their irrationality, it's their absolute refusal to accept limitations as permanent. By giving them access to infinite possibility through quantum memory access, we haven't made them more predictable, we've made their unpredictability infinitely more efficient." The enhanced subjects weren't conquering the galaxy through force or guile. They were doing something far more dangerous. They were making it better through the simple expedient of remembering futures where problems had already been solved, then implementing those solutions with the casual confidence of beings who had already seen how everything turned out. Space piracy ended when Subject 11 convinced the largest pirate fleet that they would have more fun as an interstellar courier service, specializing in impossible delivery. 3 separate border conflicts resolved themselves after enhanced subjects shared memories of futures where the involved parties had become close allies through a series of increasingly ridiculous diplomatic incidents. Even the galaxy's most persistent philosophical debates were being settled through what could only be described as aggressive empathy. The final irony became clear when Subject 3 returned to the Genesis laboratory one last time, arriving through a method she cheerfully described as temporal tourism. She found Bentes still running diagnostics on his failed experiment, his crystalline form dim with what his species called the light of inevitable understanding. "You wanted to create better humans," she explained with the patient kindness typically reserved for confused children or cosmic entities having existential crises. "The thing is, we were already perfect for what we needed to do. You just gave us the tools to do it more efficient." The hegemony had set out to solve the problem of human unpredictability by creating humans who could access all possible futures. Instead, they had created beings who could remember infinite ways to succeed, then choose whichever method seemed most interesting at the time. As Subject 3 departed, leaving behind a small note that read, "Thanks for the upgrade, Future History Department," Dr. Ventis finally understood the ultimate joke the universe had played on them. They had tried to make humans more like themselves, rational, predictable, limited by logical constraints. Instead, they had made themselves more like humans. And in a galaxy where impossible things happened every day, that was turning out to be the most terrifying development of all. The lab had indeed grown more than just humans. It had grown the memory of futures, where hope was a tactical advantage, optimism was a technology, and the impossible was just another word for Tuesday. And those futures were remembering back.